All right. I think we're recording. Okay, cool. So what I was doing a very poor job of drawing phantom circles on the screen with my mouse was showing the architecture of our app as it is currently. So we have our app.js file right up here. That's sort of the entryway point into the whole application. That is passing data to our list component, pose list, receiving data through props. So this is the flow of data down, right? The list is then passing data to, well, it's mapping through that data because it's an array, and it's essentially rendering however many pose components it needs to. So we'll just draw like, there's 15 of them because there's 15 in the data set, but we'll just draw 3 for right now. So pose, pose, pose. Now our app is pretty simple right now. We're taking advantage of the flow of data, right? Data always flows down through the application. Data down, there's a phrase when it comes to front-end frameworks, data down, actions up. Actions being triggering this functionality, like triggering these methods down low in the application and having them propagate, having their result propagate back up. So this is the flow of data. The data really only flows down. And what enables our app to work is we make our API request out over here, right? We go out to the API, data comes back, that list of poses. Then it gets set on state up in the app level. And then that state gets passed down through props to the rest of the app. So this is what enabling all of this to work. This is our core architecture here. But if we had a more complicated application that was also rendering like a control bar, like this is pretty, think of like Gmail or something like that, where you can select all messages, you can delete messages, you can perform actions with like a toolbar that affect the rest of the app. Well, if we think in terms of architecture, there's no way that that toolbar is part of a list component, right? We want to split these things up. So imagine we had a toolbar as a component that also needs to receive data so that it can do its thing. And it wants to be able to trigger actions, control functionality, delete things, make comments on the post, whatever, whatever. Just imagine some sort of extra functionality aside from just displaying things. That would definitely make sense to have in its own component. But ultimately what this component now needs to do is it needs to be able to affect things in the other components. If we mark one of these poses as one of our favorite poses, we need that to be reflected in the rest of the application. So these components now need to essentially communicate with each other. And the only way that they can do that is if they're sharing the same data. So if the list had its own state and was the one doing the get to the API and then just rendering, because we could have done it like that. Like this was almost unnecessary in the sense that the app could have just been mapping through that array of data and rendering all the poses. But ultimately, in more complex apps, your app is going to do more than just get data and render it. So let's imagine we have that toolbar. If the list had its own state and the toolbar had its own state, even if it was loaded from the same data initially, when this state changes, it doesn't change this state at all, right? State can only go down. You can't really, you can't pass state up, really. So what you need to do is lift state up to a common ancestor. So if the app is passing data to the list and down, and it's also passing the same data to the toolbar, and any components that need to be rendered down there, and the app is also where we write our methods, which also get passed down, right? We wrote that log click which deletes. So we can delete each pose from within the pose component. And what that's doing is it's triggering the method down here. So the method gets triggered by an event, a click event. But that method is bound to app.js. So the method is actually firing up here, and it's changing state up here. So this is this data down, actions up thing. So we pass the data down, and in fact, we pass our methods down as well. because we need them bound to this state up here. So now when we hit delete, it's deleting from app level state, which then says, oh, state has changed. Pass new props. So now we're passing, one pose is gone, so it's only an array of 14 now. And so the list says, hey, I got new props. I need to re-trigger my render. So it does the mapping again, and now it only renders 14 poses. Similar thing could happen if we had favorites. Maybe when you star something as a favorite in the toolbar, it gives it a property, like it actually changes the data in some way, and then favorited ones get highlighted. Like just imagine we had that functionality.
A prop called highlighted.
Yeah, you'd have like a prop called highlighted. That would be part of the data for a given pose object. So if we write that method up here in app level, we can pass that method down here, just like we pass data, and then it can trigger a favorite call, and then that propagates back up to app level state. So you can see all these arrows now going to app. This is now getting into the concept of a single source of truth. So if we control most of our data or all of our data in one place, then any component throughout the whole application that depends on that data will receive the latest, essentially. So we want all of our components, or as many of them as possible, as many of them that makes logical sense, to share the same data, have it live in the same place, so that anything that's depending on that data receives the latest copy, the latest version. And anything that needs to make actions on that data, that needs to modify it in any way or add to it, they can get triggered through methods that are attached to app level state. That's a lot. It's a lot of like concept and not a whole lot of seeing it in action. Although we do have our app wired to do this, it's not as obvious why it's so important as if we had sibling components that were also doing a bunch of things as well. And we may keep going with this and build it out. We probably won't get to that point today, but do you guys have questions about this flow of data and the reasons why we really want our data to live in one place? So I just threw a lot at you.
I think it makes sense.
All right, cool. Any questions from those of you at GT? I'll check to see if there are any. Assuming
we're good.
Okay, cool. So that being said, so the next piece of this is the rule of thumb is single source of truth. And that makes sense, right? This allows us to have good architecture, or it allows us, if we do have good architecture, to have the whole app wired up to almost take care of itself. And then once we get the architecture right, then we worry about like one method at a time that may change the data in some way, and like the rest of it just like works. We don't think about the DOM at all. We just think about the data. However, it may be appropriate at times to have a component that does control, that is lower down the hierarchy, that does control its own state. So this rule of thumb does not mean that you can only ever have one class component in your whole application. It just means that if you need mutual reliance on data, that data needs to live in a common place. So I want you to take like good 10, 15 seconds to think about a situation in which you would want a component that's lower down the hierarchy to control its own state. So this could be for this app, it could be for something else entirely, but think about why or when it would be appropriate for a child component to control its own state. Give you a little bit. And for those of you who are remote, I think you guys can just unmute and we'll make this a discussion after about 10 seconds or so. Okay, so let's talk when it's okay to have a child state, let's call it. Any thoughts?
Like, let's say for this app in particular, a user wants to add their own pose, I guess, that's like not on the list of poses.
Okay, yeah, sure. So user wants to add their own pose. And
so the component in which they would do that would have its own state that wouldn't be controlled by the rest, because you wouldn't really need to have those talk to each other, I guess.
yeah,
Right?
So let's, I love it. Great example, let's run with it. So user wants to add their own pose. So that would certainly be its own component, and it may even have subcomponents. So let's say it's a component that lives over here. I'm just going to draw it over here. I'm not going to draw the lines to attach because I don't want to confuse all that. But yeah, let's say this component is the new pose component. It probably is going to consist of, at the very least, a form, right? Where you can fill out the title of the new pose and a description, whatever, upload a picture. So there is data that this component needs to keep track of. This is a perfect example. So new pose, this is a form. And we will, not today, but we will get into how to do forms right in React. So it's going to be a form. It's going to have a bunch of inputs. Those could even be their own components, maybe. Input, and you're tracking the name of the pose, the description, whatever, all the stuff that you need. And you do need to store that. You need to control that data in some way. But does the rest of the application need to know what the title of the new pose is going to be when the person's filling out the form? No, they don't. So this component would make perfect sense to be controlled, because in fact it might get awkward if you were trying to tie all of that into the app level state. It's superfluous to the rest of the application. None of the rest of the app relies on that data as it's being constructed. It relies on it once it's part of the full data set, but that's different. So a form, it makes a lot of sense to control its own state to a degree, and then whenever that form is ready, maybe one of these is a submit button, right? Submit button, and when submit gets hit, a request goes out to the API, and new data will come back, and maybe it just sends a signal to the rest of the app, just like, hey, hit that API again. It's time to reload the data because a new post was made. It also could potentially pass the information about all this data once the submit is hit back up to the app level through a method.
And populate a 16th list.
And then, and add that new thing once it's constructed as a full object. But as the user is inputting the form, each character of input doesn't matter that much. We can wire React up to track every character of input. So if you hit the back button or something like that, like we've all filled out a form and you're halfway through and something breaks and then you lose everything, and that sucks. Front-end frameworks offer us good ways of taking care of that, but that's the kind of state that the rest of the app doesn't need to know about that much. It's a really good example. Any thoughts from our remote people? Or any questions also on this idea of having some components, when appropriate, control their own state? Oops.
No.
Okay, cool. Get rid of all of these. All right, cool. So it seems like we're on the same page as far as that goes. So I'm going to kill this video for right now, and we'll resume.